and welcome to the Watchman. You know, when I'm in Israel, I'm usually on a very tight schedule. I'm running to meetings, I'm doing interviews, I'm in briefings with Israeli officials. But no matter how busy I am or how many commitments I have, I always make time to visit the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. I can't stay away. Folks, this was the site of Solomon's temple where the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, was kept. It was also the site of the second temple where Jesus chased out the money changers. And you can still feel the presence of God there today in such an intense way. There's nothing like going to the Western Wall to pray at night. It is the holiest place in the world to the Jewish people, and as a Christian and a believer in the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, I'm also drawn to it irresistibly. But so are Muslims. No, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are never even mentioned in the Quran, not even once. And yes, they are mentioned in the Bible over 800 times. Yet, the Temple Mount is now home to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the holiest shrines in Islam. Radical Islamists, and yes, the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, refuse to even acknowledge that a Jewish temple once existed on that spot. Folks, a battle is brewing over the Temple Mount, the holiest piece of real estate in the world, and the place where the Bible says God will one day set up his eternal kingdom through his Son. So what's next? Charles Crismier is author of a new book called King of the Mountain. He who rules the Temple Mount rules the world. He's also host of the nationally syndicated radio program Viewpoint and founder of Save America Ministries. Charles, welcome.
Well, Eric, it's just been a delight to be with you, and these are exciting times.
Exciting times, and your book is very exciting, very timely, Charles. And what I love about it, it not only hits the current situation in Jerusalem and with the Islamist movement, but you go into the history of it, deep into the history of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Before we get to that, our friends at Palestinian Media Watch released a clip showing a music video that was broadcast about the Temple Mount, broadcast frequently on official Palestinian Authority TV. This is what the Palestinians are saying about the Temple Mount, folks. Take a look. Charles, this is the Palestinian propaganda, the Muslim propaganda. They say that a Jewish temple never even existed on that site. So what is the Muslim claim to the Temple Mount?
Well, in practicality, in history, there is no legitimate claim to the Temple Mount. Even in 1925, official Muslim writings indicated that Jews were, in fact, the legitimate inhabitants of the Temple Mount. They had been there, and now there's an effort to reconstruct history, to revise history, all for politically correct, religiously correct, that is, Quranic correct purposes. And so hence the battle is raging for the Temple Mount. And it's not just Islam. It's the power brokers of this world, both spiritual and geopolitical, are all converging, positioning themselves now for their final assault to fulfill biblical prophecy, because he who rules the Temple Mount rules the world. And the prophet David, we don't think of the psalmist as being a prophet, but in Psalm chapter 2, he said, "Why do the heathen rage? Why do the nations imagine a vain and foolish thing? The people have set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let's tear their bands asunder." But God responds, and he said, "I'm going to have them in derision. I have set my king on my holy hill." Hence the battle for King of the Mountain.
You know, in 1967, Charles, it seemed like, look, Israel recaptured Jerusalem, reunified Jerusalem, recaptured the Western Wall, but still today, Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism where both temples stood. Why is that?
Well, Moshe Dayan, that great Jewish general, was secularly minded. And for all practical purposes, even though Israel had accomplished something historically and spiritually significant in regaining Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, he forfeited it. he basically turned it over to the Muslim Waqf for governance, while Israel retained official you say governance, but in fact, there's a rule of law that basically says possession is 9/10 of the law. And so that's why Islam now believes and maintains throughout the world that they are the official owners of the Temple Mount and will do anything they can to wall off the Jewish people from even praying on the Temple Mount.
And folks, just so you know, Charles is a former trial lawyer, so when it comes to the law, he knows what he's talking about, including Sharia law, which we talk a lot about on the show. What I love, I said in the lead-in, Charles, one of the things I love about the book is how you get into the history of the Temple Mount of Jerusalem. Take us all the way back to really, I guess, the earliest mention or earliest acknowledgement of the Temple Mount site goes back to Abraham, right?
Well, it does go back to Abraham because God himself, believe it or not, appointed a place for Abraham to go to sacrifice his son of promise, Isaac. And what's interesting, if you go back and you read in Genesis, you find out that God actually had set aside a specific place. Abraham didn't know where it was. And so when Abraham got to that place, it says he recognized that this was the place that God had chosen. And so Abraham offers up his son of promise, and God says then, because you have been willing to give up your son of promise, now I am willing to give up my only son for the redemption of mankind. Right there on his holy hill, the very place where God chose to place his name.
How central, I mean, that just shows you, I think, Charles, how central the Temple Mount area, that site, and Jerusalem, just the city of Jerusalem, it's so central in God's eyes. Talk a bit more about that, just the centrality of Jerusalem and of that site where the temple stood and where it will stand again. Talk about the centrality of that in the Bible and in God's eyes. That's his city, that's his piece of real estate.
Well, indeed it is. And in fact, there's a competition between cities. There's the holy city, and then there is the eternal city. Yeah. There is one city on this planet that's referred to as the eternal city, one called the holy city. One is Jerusalem, the other is the Vatican. And there is competition between those two cities. And that's all set forth in the book. And what we're finding is that in this unique moment of history, all of the players, the geopolitical players, the religious players of history and the world are all being resurrected to, shall we say, put in their bid, put in their claim to become Lord of the Hill, to become King of the Mountain, just like that childhood game that so many of us played. You probably played it. Many of our sisters played it. You get up on a little hill and all your friends try to pull you down. Well, if you write that large over human history, you find where the title of the book came from. The battle for King of the Mountain. It's the epic, eternal, and even end-time battle.
Yeah, and now the Jewish people, many Jews, want to rebuild the third temple. Talk about that a bit, Charles, that movement in Israel to rebuild the temple, establish a third temple. I guess, you know, obviously on the Temple Mount where those two Muslim shrines stand right now.
Well, exactly. And the cornerstone has already been cut out. Every year they put it on a flatbed truck and circle Jerusalem with it. And all of the accoutrements, the gold menorah, all of the accoutrements for worship that were required under the law have been reconstructed. Even the priestly garments have now been reconstructed. They found the original blue dyes that were used, and so everything is now ready for, what shall we say, the propitious moment when the world will be deemed ready for this move for the Jewish people to again rebuild the temple. And here's what's fascinating. Did you know that a leading Muslim author who has published over 65 million books, met secretly with several members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious leadership, to talk about the rebuilding of the temple?
Charles, that's a great place to leave it. And you're keeping us in suspense. You got to pick up the book, King of the Mountain. Charles Crismier, thank you so much for joining us.
Great blessing.
Great talking.
Exciting times.
Great blessing, great book. And coming up, more on the struggle over the Temple Mount. Is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in danger? Chris Mitchell reports from on the ground in Israel. Stay tuned. And welcome back. Well, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Jerusalem's Temple Mount is one of Islam's most recognized structures. Just a rumor about Israel threatening the site sends Muslims around the world into a frenzy. It's a dishonest tactic aimed at undermining not only Israel, but Judeo-Christian values as well, as my colleague Chris Mitchell tells us from Israel. Take a look.
It's one of the most holy and contested pieces of real estate on earth, the Temple Mount. For decades, Islamic leaders have incited Muslims to violence by telling them that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is in danger. First, they claim that the Israelis were undermining its foundations to make it collapse. Now they also say it's a threat even for Jews to pray on the sacred plateau.
Extreme movements believe that Israel is planning to build the third temple and to destroy their holy shrine.
Known in Arabic as the Haram al-Sharif, or Noble Sanctuary, it's the place where two consecutive Jewish temples once stood. The second was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Now, Muslim mosques occupy the site. The Golden Dome of the Rock to my right is the most identifiable Muslim shrine on the Temple Mount. But it's the gray-domed Al-Aqsa Mosque to my left that Muslims consider the third holiest site in Islam. They believe that Muhammad took a famous night ride from Mecca to Al-Aqsa on his winged horse, Al-Barak. Al-Aqsa was first built in 705 AD. In Muslim theology, the site precedes the Jews and goes back to creation.
You know, Adam, when he descended from the heaven, he came here and he was pray here.
No different between Sulaiman and King David and all the prophets is all the same. They're all been in Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Today, the entire plateau is referred to as Al-Aqsa. Nadav Shragai wrote the Al-Aqsa is in danger libel, The History of a Lie. He says when Muslim leaders want to unite the masses, they claim it's in danger.
The match that ignites the people and brings them to the streets and causes violence is this libel. Al-Aqsa is in danger and this is baseless.
Archaeologist Dr. Gabriel Barkai says there have been excavations near the Temple Mount, but never under it.
One of the cornerstones of Western civilization was never touched by the spade of the archaeologist.
Barkai says it was Muslims, not Jews, who began digging in an attempt to rewrite history.
Since the 90s, there were many destructive diggings going on in the Temple Mount, which were not for archaeological purposes, but the contrary, for destroying archaeological data.
Around 2000, the Islamic religious authorities dug up thousands of years of history with bulldozers from under the Temple Mount to make room for a giant mosque. Barkai headed an operation to save artifacts from the discarded material. Years later, archaeologists and volunteers still sift through the debris. According to Shragai, then Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini started the libel against Israel in the 1930s. He accused the Jews of wanting to collapse the mosques on the Temple Mount. That led to Muslim rioting and murder of the Jews. Just the first of many incidents. Islamic expert Dr. Yitzhak Reiter says the tactic hasn't lost its potency.
They really believe in what they think. The Al-Aqsa is in danger as long as Israel is controlling the eastern part of East Jerusalem.
In 1969, the Muslim world blamed Israel for the arson attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque by a visiting Australian Christian. That lie continues today. More trouble in 1996. The worst Israeli-Palestinian violence in 30 years broke out when Israel opened an exit for visitors to the Western Wall tunnels half a mile from Al-Aqsa. And in 2004, rain, snow, and a minor earthquake toppled the entrance ramp to the Temple Mount. That provoked an international Islamic uproar when Israel tried to rebuild it. We asked Muslims in Jerusalem what they think.
It's in danger. To destroy him, to take the place. It's in danger.
They are digging underneath it and digging and they don't find anything.
God will save it.
Recently, Israel arrested a key Islamic figure for incitement. He told his followers Israel planned to break into the Temple Mount and they should use their bodies to prevent Jews from going up there. Experts say it's important the West takes notice now because millions of Muslims believe the lie is true. They say if it brought violence in the past, it will do so in the future.
Up next, what's it like taking the gospel into the darkest places in the world? Find out after the break. They're the original Islamic terrorist group. They spawned Al-Qaeda and Hamas. They're America's next great enemy, and they're in your backyard. If you want to understand the war on terror, you must first understand the Muslim Brotherhood. Pick up my new book, The Brotherhood, America's Next Great Enemy. Available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold from coast to coast. And welcome back. Well, a recent poll by the non-denominational group Open Doors found that persecution of Christians doubled in 2013 over the year before. We've reported on this program how radical Islamists are taking the lead in persecuting followers of Jesus. So how can Christians take the gospel into the Muslim world and other dangerous hotspots? We're joined now by a man who is an expert. Nick Ripken is author of a great new book called The Insanity of Obedience, Walking with Jesus in Tough Places. Nick, welcome.
Thank you, my brother.
That's great to have you with us. I have you here in one place in Washington, D.C. You're a traveling man. You're around the world constantly. First off, before we get into the book, tell us how you got into this. You told me before the break that you're traveling 90% of the time. How did you become a global missionary and taking the gospel, as your book says, into some of the toughest places in the world?
My wife and I did a foolish thing back in early 90s, and we read the book of Acts again together. And for the first time in our lives, we came up with what a definition was of someone who wanted to follow Christ internationally, and was to go where people had little or no opportunity to hear Jesus. So 2 months later, we're knocking on the door of Somalia. And probably within 6 months, we're feeding about 50,000 people a day. We're resettling people. We're doing mobile medical clinics. But what ripped the heart out of my chest was that there were about 150 believers from Islamic background in Somalia in 1991. By 1997, only 4 were left alive. And they killed 4 of my best friends on one day, maybe in 45 minutes, put a gun in the back of their head, killed them, hid the bodies. We don't know where they are even now. And I'm someone that believes that the Bible is a book in present active tense. It's a living, breathing entity of God. And I couldn't pray in Somalia, greater is He who is in me than who's in the world, because there was no evidence of that. And so in 1997, Somalis are down to 4. Our 16-year-old son dies of an asthma attack, is buried in Nairobi, Kenya, died on Easter Sunday morning. My wife's mother died 2 months to the day that our son died. And our life is shattered. And we wanted to know, is Jesus for the tough places, or is He just sort of dressed up Western Christianity? And so in 1998, we started traveling, first 10, then 45, and now 72 countries, where we've sat at the feet of believers in persecution who teach us how to make Jesus known, how to plant house churches in tough places where it can cost you your life.
Yeah, and some of the toughest places, Nick, seem to be countries like Somalia, Muslim countries. In your travels, do you find that the Muslim world is the toughest place to crack and take the gospel?
Yes, because if you look at the growth of the church in China and places like the Soviet Union, where is the persecutor? He's outside of your family. You've got this persecution that's coming from, top down. And your family might, even if they're non-believers, hide you from the government. In Islam, your persecutor is at your breakfast table. It's in the bedroom. And so when you get the government as persecutor, you can hear the gospel, believe, baptize, be in churches. But when your persecutor is at your breakfast table, they get you before you get to Jesus. So the only solution in evangelizing in Islam is reaching the whole family. The Philippian jailer, his household. Cornelius, his household. The only survivable, thrivable, if that's a word, unit of faith in Islam is an entire family coming to Jesus. And thank God the Bible gives us an example of how to do that.
Yeah, and you're seeing examples of that. You write about in the book. There are encouraging stories, right, going on. Tell us real quick about some of the encouraging things you're seeing in your travels.
It's not moderate Muslims who have houses and cars and kids in schools that are usually coming to Christ. It's the fundamentalists. It's the radicals. Why? Because they're looking for a place to belong. They're looking for spiritual truth. And they're having dreams and visions by the millions, men and women. Now, I have to say quickly, dreams and visions for Muslims are not unique. It's just part of the way they're made. What is miraculous is that God breaks into that dream, that vision, and gives it a content. Find the Bible. Find the gospel. Find Jesus. They'll dream of a man with scars in his hands, his head, and they go and they're seeking, and they'll find someone like Joseph was for Pharaoh, Ananias was for Saul, and like the Philip was for the Ethiopian eunuch, and God's still doing it.
Nick, we got to wrap it up. Thank you so much for what you're doing. God bless you. We're praying for you.
Thank
the book
you.
is called The Insanity of Obedience. Pick it up. And after the break, why is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quoting from the Bible? Stick around. Welcome back. Did you know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu holds Bible studies from time to time at the Prime Minister's residence? Or that one of his sons won a national Bible quiz in Israel a few years ago? Folks, I've been very intrigued by Prime Minister Netanyahu's interest in the Bible. He's taken to quoting from it when he gives speeches at international forums like the UN, and he's even talked publicly about how Israel is fulfilling biblical prophecy. During a recent speech to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in Washington, he again talked about Israel's biblical claim to the land. Take a look.
The land of Israel is the place where the identity of the Jewish people was forged. It was in Hebron that Abraham bought the cave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. It was in Bethel that Jacob dreamed his dreams. It was in Jerusalem that David ruled his kingdom. We never forget that, but it's time the Palestinians stop denying history.
Well, thanks for joining us this week on The Watchman, and until next week, remember, never hold your peace. God bless.